That evening, Jane was well enough to leave her room for a few hours. Bingley made sure the fire was well built up before he sat down by her. Elizabeth was delighted to see that he hardly spoke to anyone else. While Jane and Bingley talked, Darcy took up a book. Caroline Bingley did the same, but she secretly spent most of the time watching Mr. Darcy read. Mrs. Hurst played with her rings and bracelets. Now and then she joined in her brother's conversation with Jane. Mr. Hurst went to sleep. After a while, Caroline gave a great yawn and said, "How pleasant it is to spend a quiet evening reading." No one answered her. She yawned again and began walking about the room. Although her figure was elegant, Darcy didn't look up from his book. Then she invited Elizabeth to walk about the room with her. Now Darcy looked up. Without knowing what he was doing, he closed his book. Caroline invited him to join them, but he politely refused. He said it would interfere with their purpose. "What do you mean by that?" Caroline demanded. "Because you want to show off your figures by walking," Darcy answered. "I can see you much better sitting by the fire." "Oh, how shocking!" Caroline cried out. "How shall we punish him?" "Tease him, laugh at him," Elizabeth suggested quietly. "No," Caroline said. "It is impossible to laugh at Mr. Darcy." "Mr. Darcy is not to be laughed at?" Elizabeth asked mockingly. "So, he has no faults at all?" "Oh, I don't believe that's possible for anyone," Darcy said. "But all of my life I've tried to avoid faults that others might find laughable." "Such as vanity and pride," Elizabeth said. "Yes," Darcy agreed. "Vanity is a fault indeed. But pride, when one's mind is truly superior, that is not a fault." Elizabeth turned away to hide a smile. Then she said, "I am convinced then. You must truly have no faults at all." "Oh, but I do," Mr. Darcy said. "I cannot forget or forgive the follies and vices of others. If I lose my good opinion of someone, it is lost forever." "Yes, that is a fault indeed," Elizabeth retorted. "But you have chosen your defect well. It really isn't laughable. It seems that your defect makes it easy for you to hate everybody. Your fault," Darcy said with a smile, "is to misunderstand them." Caroline was impatient. "Now let's have a little music," she said. She was tired of a conversation in which she had no share. When the pianoforte was opened, Darcy was relieved. He felt more attracted to Elizabeth than he ever wanted to. If it weren't for her low connections, he feared that he could fall in love with her. The next day, Caroline teased him about paying so much attention to Elizabeth. When Jane was well enough to travel on Sunday, Darcy was relieved to see Elizabeth leave. Later, when the whole Bennet family was together again, Mr. Bennet announced a surprise. A young man, a stranger, was coming to visit for several days. "The visitor is my cousin, Mr. Collins," Mr. Bennet explained. "This is the gentleman who will inherit our home when I'm dead. He may turn you all out of the house if he likes." "Oh!" Mrs. Bennet cried out. "Please don't even mention that horrid man. It's dreadful that our home will not be passed on to your own children. How unfair that the property can only be passed on to male heirs." "I agree. It is certainly most unfair," Mr. Bennet said. "But if you'll listen to the letter he sent me, perhaps you'll forgive him a little." The letter read: "Dear Sir, the disagreement between yourself and my father has always made me unhappy. Now that he is gone, I feel that it is my duty to make peace between our families. I never wished to hurt your daughters. Indeed, I am ready to make amends. William Collins." The peacemaking Mr. Collins arrived at 4 o'clock. He was a tall, overweight young man. His manners were very formal. Mr. Collins had been raised by an illiterate and stingy father. He had begun life humbly, but he had been lucky. He'd been given a living by Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who lived in Kent. His new rank in life made him a mixture of pride and modesty. With the gift of a living, he received a home, land, and appointment as the religious leader of the local church. At dinner, Mr. Collins talked at great length about Lady Catherine. No praise was too high for her. He took pride in paying her many delicate compliments. "Do these compliments come from the impulse of the moment?" Mr. Bennet asked. "Or do you think of them beforehand?" "Oh, I often spend my time thinking up elegant little compliments," Mr. Collins said. "They're useful for many occasions." Mr. Bennet smiled. He found Mr. Collins completely absurd. Now he was enjoying himself thoroughly. Mr. Collins' motive for making amends too. His cousins soon became clear. He intended to marry one of them. Jane was his first choice, until Mrs. Bennet hinted that Jane was likely to be engaged soon. In that case, he settled on Elizabeth. Mrs. Bennet was delighted. She never dreamed that she might have 2 daughters married soon. The man she'd called horrid the day before was now high in her good graces. The next day, Mr. Collins walked with his cousins to Maryton. All along the way, he delivered pompous remarks. His polite cousins agreed with everything he said. As they reached Maryton, however, Lydia and Catherine began looking up and down the streets in search of officers. They spotted an officer they knew, Mr. Denny, walking with a stranger. Mr. Denny introduced them to a man named Mr. Wickham, who'd recently joined their corps. Mr. Wickham was completely charming. He had a handsome face, a slender body, and pleasing manners. The whole party was chatting very agreeably when they heard the hoofbeats of horses. Darcy and Bingley were coming down the street. Bingley greeted Jane happily. He'd been on his way to the house to ask about her health. Darcy bowed to the party. Determined not to fix his eyes on Elizabeth, he suddenly noticed the stranger. Elizabeth happened to see Darcy and Wickham exchange surprised glances. Darcy's face had turned red, and Wickham's had turned white. What could be the meaning of it? Elizabeth wondered. It was impossible to imagine. And it was just as impossible not to wonder about.